We will talk about scalability, especially for managers. That means product owners, product managers, project managers, because I believe it's important for them to also know some basic technical concept about scaling. We're going to talk about development best practices that the PM should know. We're going to talk about architecture, and we're also going to throw out some general tips for managers in order to get better familiar with the topic. Now, scalability, the first thing you might think is, it's something that we just take care of. But imagine you want to call an Uber and you see there at the same time hundreds of thousands of people calling Uber using the Uber app. And you don't really know what's happening behind the scenes, but Uber is a super scaling app. It's valued at over $160 billion right now. So that's something that's a system that always needs to work and always needs to be fast, because everything that's slow will cost the company money. And we will also be in the position, and hopefully you as well, where you need a scaling software, because once something scales, we all make money. Okay, so let's go into this topic. And just to prefix that, I'm a project manager, but I'm also a developer. I have a computer science degree and I've built some scalable apps myself. For example, I have helped to vaccinate 10,000 people every day in a sum of over 1 million people over the course of a couple of weeks. And I know how it is when pipelines just are on the edge of collapsing, when something is so much under load that you just need to ramp up a system. For me, it is more natural because I know the technology behind it. But in this talk, I want to give a bit more insights of what you can learn as a project manager, also to get a better understanding of this topic. One of the reasons why PMs should understand the topic is that they're able to plan the resources accordingly. And this has just something with Excel, where you can just have a look at how much users do you going to expect in the next days and weeks after launch. And this is something we're going to talk about later as well. That's something, it's just important for a project manager to know what are the things that the system is going to hit once it launches, and what are the stones we need to put in place in order to build the scalability into the system. So it's just a planning thing. Project managers need to know that. But also it's very important for project managers to know how to talk with developers, right? And someone who's not technical at all, they always have a harder time connecting to the developers. So by just understanding the basics, it makes things easier. And also when you talk with the developers, especially before the system got built, it's going to be easier for you to plan the system. So having a good bond with the developers, they're going to tell you if something breaks. We're going to get to that as well. Another thing that's actually also quite interesting is that developers always want to optimize something, and they often do this too early. As a project manager, if you understand when optimization actually makes sense, when you need it for scaling, and when it's just something that people like to play around with, if you understand this distinction, then it's going to help you also push the project further, faster than you would usually could. Let's talk about a couple of mental models. A mental model is a compression of an idea. It's like a perspective on a certain phenomenon that makes it easier to grasp. So for our scalability issues, we also have a couple of mental models that I distilled here in this video. The most interesting thing, and that's something that I've experienced as a developer quite a lot, is premature optimization. That basically means that someone optimizes a system even though it's not the right time. And developers love to do that, and I touched base on this previously in the intro. Developers love to play around with something that they think is super cool to make. And yes, this includes scaling, this includes optimization. And as a project manager, it's always good to know when that is the right time to do it and when it's not the right time to do it. Another mental model is breaking down a process into different actors. And those actors are background processes. So it's very good to think about something in a pipeline where actors do certain tasks. We had this in something where a lot of OCR tasks were being performed by an API. So this was an actor, and the actor took certain time to do. And then we had another actor, which was a human, to correct those outputs from the OCR API. The OCR is basically just text recognition in PDFs. And by looking at it in a pipeline perspective and also seeing that the OCR text has a certain latency and the person doing something has a certain latency, but might also just start 2 hours later, that would help us to break down the whole thing as a pipeline. And from there, we can then much better calculate how much is the actual load of a system in terms of scalability, and when we need to optimize something, and also how much is possible. So writing something down in a pipeline makes it easier to grasp later on. And there's another point I want to go on, which is the so-called bottleneck theory. And bottleneck theory means a process that has different actors in it will always be as slow as the slowest actor. So in this picture here, you see clearly that the P3, the process 3, if that's the slowest, the whole pipeline is constrained by this one actor. So even though a developer might say, yeah, let's optimize process 1 or the other process 1 here, it might be interesting for them, but it might not lead to the outcome that we want, which is maximizing the throughput of the whole pipeline. So in this case, only P3 needs to get worked on. Another mental model is to think small before we think big. So if we have a process that we optimize once, it's like a small process, and we make this one fast, then the whole thing in aggregation will also be fast. So something that runs a lot of times, it makes sense to optimize that, because if it gets executed a lot of times, then suddenly a small lag will become a big lag later on. And speaking of thinking small and then going big, the next sections will be the development best practices, and then we go into the architecture best practices. The development best practices, as I said, if something works in the small, it's going to work better in the big scope. That means that if we optimize how the development is being done according to best practices, and is already fast even in the development setting or on a staging server or on a preview or test server, then we can ensure that the whole system scales much better. So let's get into a couple of best practices. One thing is design data structures. So what do we actually use here? Do we use a SQL database? Do you use a NoSQL? What kind of data structures do we use in a computation? So quite often it's better to use hash maps if you want to look up certain values than to use arrays with keys inside. This is something that the developers usually know. And as a project manager, you don't need to look into this too much, but sometimes you can ask, hey, how do you think about the data structure here? Is there something that could be done better? And also, how much would this give us in terms of scalability later on? These are things that are important for the developers, but as a project manager, sometimes it's also good to just ask questions. Another thing important for an optimized runtime of a web application is front-end queries. There is this concept of n+1 queries, which basically means, imagine you have a list and the list gets queried from the server and then it shows the list. This in itself is fine. But what if you have multiple items that get queried from each list item? Then suddenly the whole query can become very slow. And the solution to this problem here is GraphQL. It's one solution. It doesn't mean it's the best solution, but it's one solution. I want to quickly show how this actually works. So the idea with a REST API, you have a certain resource that you get. For example, here it's API, it's users. You get the users, and then you can also get the addresses. And in order to get a certain address, you specify the user ID. So that's usually a REST call. And yes, the developer could code it in a way that gives you more data, but let's assume this is just the normal REST API as it often comes out of the box. GraphQL eliminates these costly n+1 queries by giving you the opportunity to specify the address as well. So imagine you query 1,000 users. In the first example, you would need to first query all the users, and then you have to query 1,000 times the address for each user. Of course, the developer would always give you a better REST API if you have a good one. This would usually not happen it would be very stupid to implement this in the wild, but GraphQL already takes care of it basically out of the box. You would say, give me all the users, and to each user, give me all the addresses. And there you go, the addresses come with that. So that's the idea of GraphQL. It's a very good way to work. It takes a bit more time to actually implement it, but I'm actually a fan of GraphQL. And now let's talk about the big picture, architecture. If you want to scale with the architecture, there are a couple of things that also the project managers need to know. If we run into bottlenecks, let's say too many users hit our server and we want to scale, then we can scale first horizontal. That means we just buy more machines. Usually the problems attached to that is that suddenly you need to provision these machines, you need to update the software to all the machines, and you also need to load balance between them. That's the usually the way where you can scale very well, but it also takes more time to set it up. A much easier way is just to do vertical scaling, is just to give more power to your server. So the approach for a scaling problem first should always be buy more power to the machine, like upgrade the machine and buy a bigger server and hope that the scaling problem gets out of the way. But then ideally once this problem is solved, it's usually not solved for long because more users might come, then go into horizontal scaling and make sure that there's actually a system that scales over multiple machines. Another thing to know is load testing, and this can be done even before the launch. You can ask the developers to write a script for you just to hit the server many times. And there are also services out there that do load balancing or load testing for your application. It depends on how many users you're going to expect, but in general, it makes sense to do some kind of load testing, at least on a very small script level, and also at least for the most important processes. So let's say you would really have a pipeline that processes certain things. Have a look if you can trigger this one thing 1,000 times at the same time or 1,000,000 times at once. And now there are a couple of basics that we really need to know. One is monitoring. That means how many users are actually currently on the platform, and what's the performance what's the performance of the servers? What is the implications of those many users on the server? If that's clear and that's visible to the whole team, and of course also to the project manager, that's always a bonus. And then the tip that gives you the most bang for the buck is using a content delivery network. And yes, the developers in your team probably already did that, but if they didn't, have a look if that's being used. And of course, it's not for every application, but usually the web applications or any kind of application we're using these days have some kind of system where the cloud caches certain elements, even if it's just images or just videos. But also websites usually get cached, or even web requests. They can get cached so that you basically have vertical scaling built in, and those things are read-only, meaning they're super fast. And I want to close this video by giving a couple of actionable tips for PMs. If you got time to prepare, just have a look at these and see which ones you can take, and it's probably going to be good for your project. The first thing is to really calculate what we're dealing with. You can ask the developers, and you can ask maybe other stakeholders or the people giving you, let's say someone provisioned you an API, like some third-party API, or someone made your web service internally. You can ask them, how long does it take to execute one? And the developers might test it for you and tell you, okay, this API call takes 10 seconds. Okay, now you can go ahead and make your Excel spreadsheet where you say, okay, what if we have 10,000 users at the same time? What will this API, how long will it take for this API to respond? And then you would have some kind of idea how the system will respond, and you can already prepare this. I've honestly never seen anyone doing this. But I think it makes a lot of sense, just because it's very easy to do, and also it will put you into the mindset of thinking about the system more. My pet peeve with project managers usually is that they're not technical enough. A project manager that prepares in such a way is always be respected by developers. And then there's something that is more like a tip on communication with the developers. Just ask them, so it's like a post-mortem question. You ask them, imagine the system broke. Just imagine we launch today and tomorrow the system is dead. What would be the reason? And so the developers will get back with a couple of different answers. And if there's one answer that pops up more and more times, then it's probably a good answer, a good thing that you should look into, and maybe give them a bit more time to ponder on this problem and solve it before you launch. Another question that can also help is just asking them, what would they do with more time? Would they just improve the code? Would they do something totally different? Would they refactor a certain part of the system even? If it's a refactoring answer, then there might be something which goes quite badly in the project, and then you need to discuss this more. But usually if they would say, yeah, they just want to clean up something, usually those things are good. But yeah, ask the question before, because many developers, they like to optimize in the beginning, and then later on, they just don't have the experience how it is with a system that suddenly gets hit by thousands, millions of users. So it really depends on what software you're working on. Do you have a software that where a lot of users come, like a web app that you can cache? Do you have an application that has a lot of background processes, a lot of compute in between? So those are the things that where you would get different answers to this question. Another tip I would give to any PM is sometimes just dialing down the features a bit. Is it possible to take this feature out of it or do it later and do it well? How about we give another extra 2-3 days or a week to improve a certain feature that already exists and make it better, make it faster? Scalability is not just a way of seeing that an app not get crushed under a user load, but it's also a way of seeing that an app that where some users come on, that those users are served in a really fast way. So just keep that in mind, where you might want to have an app that has great usability, and that usually comes also with good speed. Another tip for PMs from me as a developer is talk with the admins. Usually PMs never talk to admins. Just because admins, they have their set of things, they do these things, and that's the way they do it, and that was it, and usually those things work. But just asking them, how would they deal with more users? What would happen if that was the case? What if something breaks? What happens? What is the actually escalation hierarchy? What if something breaks? Who gets called first? All these things they need to be known by the PM in order to ensure a smooth launch later on. And the last tip I want to give you is get a dashboard. Dashboards are great, and you as a PM, you love them. I'm sure you do, because they would really show you the key metrics of the application. And the key metric also includes users, and they includes performance. You should know when the servers break. And if you have that, I'm gonna show you the life of you as a PM will be amazing. What's your experience? Is there something that I forgot that I should include into the next video? I would love it if you drop a comment below and subscribe to my videos to get more like this. See you in the next one.